This video is on aggregate demand, and in particular, it's going to deal with monetary policy and fiscal policy. What we're going to do is we're going to start this video off with some questions that John Maynard Keynes, an economist in the early 20th century, was dealing with. And basically, Keynes was trying to figure out what caused the massive economic downturns in the world in the 1930s, especially in the United States. And he theorized that the reasons for the downturn was a collapse in demand. People weren't buying anything. And if people are not buying anything, you don't produce anything, and people are unemployed as a result. So basically, Keynes theorized that if it was demand was the problem, maybe demand is the source of the solution. So the questions he was asking is, what are the components of demand? And that's another way of saying, what are the different sources of demand? And then what determines the spending level for each of those sources of demand? And then finally, will there be enough demand to maintain enough output to put everyone to work? So let's look at this. What we're going to do is we're going to use supply and demand to establish where the economy needs to be in terms of output and where the economy really is. And we're going to be using aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And of course, aggregate supply and aggregate demand are just simply the entire supply and the entire demand for the entire economy. And we're going to see where the two cross, and where the two cross establishes the level of output. So think of equilibrium as where we are, but that's not necessarily where we want to be. So let's take a look at this. Here's the aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and you can see where they cross right there. Now QE, again, think of QE not as equilibrium, but think of that as reality. This is the amount of output that the economy is being produced. Now, this is a very important point. For every level of output, there is an associated unemployment rate. And that makes sense, right? Because the reason why people are unemployed or employed is because of what is being produced. So the question is this enough output to put everyone who wants to work to work? If it's not, we could possibly shift the aggregate demand curve over to the right. So let's say QF is where we want to be. QF is simply our goal. Well, if we're right here, that means the level of output is short of our goal of full employment. We could either shift the AS curve to the right, or we could shift the AD curve to the right. And in this case, you can see the AD curve is shifting, and you can look at the new equilibrium level of output happens to be right equal to the full employment level of output. And so if we're going to figure out how to shift demand, we got to figure out what are the different components of demand. And you're going to find this very, very familiar because it's also the components of GDP. When you look at there's consumption demand, investment demand, there's the demand for government services, and then finally there is the demand for exports. So if any one of those things change, the demand curve shifts to the right. So let's look at consumption demand. That's the demand that made by households. So stereos, cars, Big Macs, consumption demand. And this is the largest component of demand, especially in the United States. Roughly 70% of all output is for consumption use. And so Keynes figured, hey, if this is the biggest component of demand, if we affect this, we could have the biggest impact on aggregate demand in terms of shifting it to the right. And so what makes people buy more goods and services? And Keynes quickly figured out that If you give people more income, they spend more. If they spend more, you get more output. So income is a primary driver of consumption demand. And in particular, disposable income, because of course your gross income, you can't spend all of it. So Keynes basically focused most on disposable income. And so what Keynes was trying to figure out is, if you give somebody an extra dollar of income, how much of that will be spent and how much will be saved? And he came up with this very, very simple equation. Y sub D is simply disposable income, and you're either going to spend it, that's consumption spending, or save it, that's S for savings. These two have to equal your disposable income. So here, this is a simple graph that's going to track your spending on the vertical axis and your income on the horizontal axis. And what I'm going to do first is establish a line of reference. This 45-degree line simply shows when income equals spending. So for example, if you're earning $3,000 and you spend all of your money, you're going to be on this point of the curve right here. And that means you spend $3,000. So whenever you have an actual data point on this line, basically you are spending all of your income. But what we see here is, we see this is the actual consumption line, this green line right here. And notice how this consumption line lies below the 45-degree line, which simply says there's some level of savings. For example, let's look at roughly 1992 data. Let's assume that you're earning $5,000. Well, in 1992, we were on this part of the line, and notice how it's below the 45-degree line, which meant that you only spent about $4,600. So any point on this line tells you that you're below the 45-degree line, which simply means that you're not spending all of your income. Of course, if we had a point above the 45-degree line, that would mean that you are spending more than your income, which means you are either dipping into your savings or you are utilizing credit. So Keynes wanted to break this relationship between income and spending in two ways. He's going to look at the ratio of total consumption, total spending, to total disposable income, and then the relationship of the changes in consumption to changes in disposable income. This second one is the most important one, because this is what you're interested in. If the government does something to give people more income, you want to know how the change in that income affects the change in your spending. And that's why we have to distinguish between average propensity to consume and marginal propensity to consume. Average propensity to consume is you just take your total spending over your total income. But what we're interested in, let me just go to this one right here, is how is your spending affected when we change your income? And that's marginal propensity to consume. And you can see here is, we look, if we change your income, that's the denominator, how does this affect your consumption? And that's your MPC. And by a simple case of arithmetic, your marginal propensity to consume is going to be, if you add it to your marginal propensity to save, it's got to equal 1. And here's a good example. Watch. If I give you $1 extra, if you save 20 cents, that must mean that you must be spending 80 cents. So MPC plus MPS must equal 1. And with this, we could come up with a consumption function. A consumption function is simply an equation that says if you tell me how much you earn, I can tell you how much you spend. And we could break the consumption function into two parts. One part is spending that has nothing to do with your income. Think about if you lose your job. If your income drops to 0, you're still going to be spending something on food, rent. You may have to dip into your savings to do it, but you still will be spending something. And then there's spending that has to do with income. We call it income-dependent spending. And we could come up with an equation that has dependent and independent and income-dependent parts to the equation. And that's what gives us our consumption function. So let's take a look at that. Pretty straightforward, right? We're going to put some equations here. Let's just take a look at the equation and then we'll break for this video. The equation is going to look like this. This is consumer spending right here, consumption spending. And A is spending that has nothing to do with income. We call this autonomous consumption. Then this right here, this part is income dependent spending. And that's going to be a product of your MPC, marginal propensity to consume, and your income. So if I give you $1 more income, if I multiply it by your marginal propensity to consume, that tells me how much your spending is affected. So these are the parts that make up the consumption function. And we're going to take this up in the next video.